So this is our podcast and it's titled Implications and Ethics of Genetic Engineering. And now I'll just say a quick summary of our case study. So malaria is a mosquito-borne disease in which an infected mosquito can transmit a disease to a human host. There are over 40 species of mosquitoes that are capable of transmitting malaria. This has become a major concern to public health for populations in Sub-Saharan Africa. A possible solution to this was vector control, which is reducing the number of mosquito vectors in order to reduce malaria transmission. Vector control included the use of insecticide-treated bed nets and residual sprays to kill mosquitoes, and this also contributed to the halving of malaria-related deaths from close to 200 million to 450,000. Despite these gains, progress in reducing malaria transmission is stalling due to the growing emergence of insecticide resistance, so there is a need for additional innovations to vector control. One innovation is genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is introducing genetic traits into a population that will affect its ability to transmit a disease. So these mosquitoes will contain a more desirable genetically modified trait and introduce this trait to its population via mating. To conduct these new technologies, the company CRISPR have been using gene drives to show proof that they can control the mosquitoes that transmit disease to suppress the populations in sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria burden is the highest. Although this sounds like a great idea, is this ethical, and what does this mean for societies beyond sub-Saharan Africa and in the future? In this podcast, we're taking a look at the use of gene drives on mosquitoes to control the spread of malaria, while also discussing its ethical implications and the possible implications gene drives can have on society. Of course, this podcast will not be conducted on our own. We have a wonderful guest speaker who is willing to share her knowledge about genetic discoveries. I'll now introduce Professor Lindley Darden. She is a professor at the University of Maryland, and more specifically, a professor of philosophy and a historian of biology. Her research focuses on reasoning and scientific change, and she has studied the discovery of biological mechanisms such as evolutionary and genetic mechanisms. Altogether, she has a profound background in biological and scientific discoveries, and we are happy and extremely grateful to have her here today. So we have a couple of questions prepared to ask Professor Darden on our case study, and we'll go right into them. So our first question is, what ethical concerns do you see with the topic of genetic engineering of mosquitoes?
Well, there's a question of what kind of ethics we're talking about. Typically, historically, ethics was just applied to human beings and the way human beings interact with each other. And there are two basic, among other forms of ethics with regard to human interaction. One has to do with basic rights, like a right to life, and the other has to do with utilitarianism, which deals with the consequences of actions and judging whether it's right or not in terms of consequences. Now, applying this question to the environment is an interesting one. Environmental ethics is a much newer field than ethics applied to human beings. Ethics applied to humans goes back to Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, and there's quite a long tradition there. We have quite a few courses on that here at the University of Maryland. Both practical ethics, like is abortion ethical or euthanasia ethical, and ethical theory, which talks about different kinds of ethics and how you might choose one system versus the other. But applying it to the environment is a big step. And I designed, and other people now teach, a course called Philosophy of the Environment, where we actually talk about this issue. What is it to be environmental ethics? And so there's this question, if we take the rights view and the consequences utilitarian view, and we think about trying to transfer that to talk about the environmental ethics, this is the background. I'm getting to mosquitoes soon. The question is, does the environment itself have any rights? Does it have, one of the questions that the environmental ethics people ask, does it have inherent worth that we need to respect in the way that we say with respect to human life? And that's controversial. Now, you all are in global issues, and so policy and consequences should be very familiar to you, doing cost-benefit analysis, and that comes straight out of the utilitarian ethics position. So that one is probably most relevant as we talk about the ethics of applying gene drives in populations to mosquitoes. What are the consequences? And are we talking about the consequences to mosquitoes? Well, we're not concerned, I suppose, with the right to life of mosquitoes, though we could talk about the role they play in an ecosystem and whether wiping them out, either just in Africa where they carry malaria, or say in my garden in Greenbelt where I'd love to get rid of them, whether they're consequences for the ecosystem from wiping out a given species. Now, I don't actually know enough about the role that mosquitoes play in an ecosystem, but that might be a research topic if you all want to look more at this. But let's look at the consequences for humans, which I take it is what you all are perhaps more asking me about as you ask about the ethics of doing this. Well, of course, it would be very good for people not to get malaria. And so if we could confine the gene drive effects just to the areas where malaria occurs, which we could do if we used another technology, which the paper you sent me talked about, which was releasing sterile males, then you could confine it to a given area. And you could say, well, yes, of course, for those people to wipe out that malaria population of mosquitoes and prevent malaria in that human population, that would be a good consequence and we want to do it. Gene drive introduces another dimension, and that is it keeps going. They reproduce the genetic modification that prevents the mosquitoes. I assume it would eventually completely wipe out the population. And if it spreads beyond where they're released, it could affect all the mosquitoes in the world that are able to mate with the ones that have the gene drive form. Now, from my point of view, it was a good thing that we wiped out smallpox. And so maybe we would, for human beings, and I wasn't concerned about the smallpox, I guess it was a bacterium. So we could say, all right, the consequences for humans would be very good of getting rid of malaria and any other mosquito-borne diseases and the insect bites that we don't like to have. So we could say it would be ethical to do it because the consequences for humans would be very good.
Thank you so much. That was a very good answer. And speaking of the consequences on humans, do you believe that if we proceed with further development of similar biological mechanisms and genetic mutation of other animals, that we would move towards that for humans to prevent diseases? And do you think this is a good idea?
Well, I don't think we're going to use a gene drive that creates sterility for humans. I mean, we may be concerned with overpopulation, but this would not be, we would not want to introduce some kind of gene drive that would wipe out all humans. So no, we're really talking about using it like pesticides, like sterile release of sterile males in insect populations. Now, there are all kinds of other issues that are raised by considering other kinds of genetic engineering with regard to human beings. But a gene drive for sterility, no, we're not going to do that with humans.
Awesome, thank you. So this is our next question. Do you believe that genetic mutation will become more common in the future?
You mean the genetic mutation that's introduced by a gene drive?
Yes.
Well, that's the point of it. They introduce the mutation in a given small population, and as it mates, it gets transferred to the things that it mates with, and it does it fairly quickly in a gene drive. So if it were introduced at all, the goal would be to have it rapidly spread in the population. Was that the question? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. Thank you very much. And this was our third question. So how will I think you kind of like answered it like in your other, when you were answering the other questions, but how will genetic mutations eventually affect our society?
Right. So There are definitely problems with invasive species. You've probably studied that if you've done philosophy environment issues and looked at ecosystem problems of native species versus exotic introduced species. And the introduction of exotic species is a real problem around the world. And we just had, you know, in my grandmother's time, we had a blight that killed all the chestnut trees. Right now, we've got an emerald ash borer that's killing all the ash trees. Those are used to make baseball bats, which is some curious fact I learned once we found out about this invasive bug that's killing them. So you can certainly see there might well be other places where you would like to introduce a gene drive to wipe out an insect, or a gene drive to wipe out a non-native species of a plant. But as the article that you read indicated, the problem is keeping it confined. Because if that species, say, is a nuisance in one location, but it's an important species that's part of a natural ecosystem that you wouldn't want to wipe out elsewhere, then that's a difficulty, particularly with all the global connections between, say, Wuhan and Seattle. You know, anything you do in one place can get on an airplane these days and go anywhere in the whole world, whole Earth space. So you really do have to consider that whatever you introduce in whatever species, one place might well spread beyond where it's a nuisance to the rest of the earth. And what would the implications be for elsewhere? And that would have to be weighed in each case. And I honestly don't know with the ash borer case whether it plays a positive role somewhere that it came from. You need to do some ecological research to find that out.
Thank you. And then a follow-up question to that, which you answered a little bit, but as far as the development of the continuation of the development and the spread of the use of gene drives, how far is too far? Is there a definitive point, or would it depend on each case?
Right now, I would say mosquitoes are likely to get a positive review as something that to apply gene drive to, given how serious the diseases are that they cause and how most people had rather never have a mosquito around them. Once you go to other species, then it's going to have to be evaluated, I think, on a case-by-case basis. I don't think you're going to want to say, this looks like a panacea, and you're going to want to apply it widely without a lot of environmental impact study.
Thank you so much. And then beyond the environmental impact, what socio-cultural impacts do you see with the use of gene drives?
Well, one of the questions that arises, and this particularly arises with regard to the Gates Foundation work in Africa to help prevent diseases, including malaria. If we're wiping out diseases that have had a large effect on controlling populations, will that lead to population explosion? And I heard Melinda Gates actually address this question in an interview, which I thought was an interesting one. Her argument was, if parents know that most of their children will live to adulthood as opposed to dying of malaria or another disease early on, they may well, particularly as women have more opportunities to spend time in their lives doing other things than child raising, they may well decide to have fewer children. They wouldn't have to think they have to have a large group in order for some of them to survive. And of course, as we know, in more developed countries, as women have more economic opportunities, they often have fewer children. So you have to think about whether how prevention of disease affects human populations and what the implications are of that.
All right, thank you so much. I think we have one more major question. So you talked a lot about the different implications. Do you see possible consequences to spreading this? Because I know you mentioned that this might impact human populations as well. How is the intersection between the different types of consequences?
We indicated we aren't going to apply gene drives to produce sterility in humans. Okay, so that one's off the table. We've talked about whether if we applied gene drives to malaria in Africa, that could affect human population. We talked about how if we applied gene drives to other species in one location, it might spread much more widely, and that might have bad consequences for that ecosystem or for the people using that ecosystem in some way. I haven't actually mentioned the phrase. It's a very one that the UN really likes. It's called ecosystem services. You know, like trees produce oxygen. What are all the things that that the ecosystem does for humans? And so that's a way of casting this net a bit broader, not just about gene drive, but about environmental ethics issues in general. If we take a human consequence position, then there's the question of what do ecosystems do for us? And there's a whole list of them. And that is the broader way of talking about this issue.
Thank you so much for all of your answers and your knowledge and contributing so much to our podcast and your insight. We really appreciate it.
Well, it was a pleasure. I'm no longer teaching undergraduates, and so it's very nice to see a few of you. And I wish you all the best in your studies.
Thank you so much. It was so wonderful to meet you too.
Yeah, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It was nice talking to you. Thank you for helping us with our podcast.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
We could talk about human genetic modification. Anybody want to spend a minute or two talking about that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this, of course, is a very big issue with regard to genetics in medicine, because we are now able to do gene sequencing in humans and find genes that either are causative or are increase the risk for certain diseases. It's much more difficult yet to figure out how to change those genes. And there are many other therapies for diseases other than gene editing, though there is definitely a lot of research going on in that. So were there any lingering questions about that topic you wanted to ask about?
I guess maybe like the difference of the ethical debate when you're talking about that, because I know you talk to, like, you know, with animals, it's a whole different conversation with ethics, but if we're actually doing gene editing.
Yeah, so there's bioethics versus environmental ethics. And your gene drive question about with malaria and mosquitoes brought us into the framework of environmental ethics. And that's what we spent the podcast talking about. But when we talk about whether we can identify and then edit the genes in humans who have diseases, then we're doing bioethics. And that's actually a different course at Maryland. And we do have a course on that too. I have a colleague, Sam Kirsten, who's the chair of the philosophy department, who teaches the bioethics course. And I always did a bit of bioethics in my philosophy of biology course. And of course, there are many issues that raises. And there's a key distinction between editing in the somatic cells and editing in the germ cells. I don't know if you've had enough biology to know that distinction, but somatic cells is all of the body except the sperm or the egg. And so it's much less controversial to do things in the somatic cells, just like, you know, giving you a cataract surgery and putting in a new lens. You go in the body and you put in a new gene, and people might breathe better, say, if you could do it for cystic fibrosis. But editing the germ cells would affect future generations. And that's, of course, what your gene drive is doing also with mosquitoes. It's not just affecting killing that one mosquito, but it's affecting future generations of that population. And that is currently not legal in the United States, to do gene editing of germ cells that would affect an embryo that would be passed on into future generations. So that's a biological distinction raises very important ethical issues about whether we would be willing to change genes that would affect future generations. Now, suppose you were Ashkenazi Jews and you married and you had a Tay-Sachs. You knew you were at risk for having a Tay-Sachs baby, and those babies die before age 5, maybe even earlier. If you have the chance of editing that gene out of that embryo so that the baby would live and so that that baby wouldn't have or carry that disease into future generations, would you want to do it? Now, those are the really tough ones where it's a lethal disease. We don't yet know how to safely make those gene changes, but the CRISPR technology is much more precise and focused than we've had prior to the discovery of CRISPR, to go in, find a particular gene, see if we could take in a good one and change it. That's going to be the big issue in the coming years with regard to bioethics.
Thank you very much for that
Yeah,
extended
thank you so
conversation.
much.
Thank you so much.
Nice to talk to all of you.
Thank you so much, Professor Darden, for all the knowledge and wisdom you have shared with us today. We sincerely appreciate your time and your willingness to participate in our podcast. And we have most definitely learned something today, and this information will definitely resonate with us. With that being said, this is the end of our podcast. Thank you so much for listening.